We don't have to post this anywhere if you guys don't want to.
You can post anything I say anytime.
But you were talking about abductions, and you were talking about regressions and abductions, and my question was, how much of this information do you think is real that these people are getting?
It's only as real as the treatment they're getting is intending it to be, because I've found so many inconsistencies in what some of these people say. And of course, you take Travis Walton, for instance. There was a movie made of his abduction, and he came right out and said, nothing in that movie is portraying what happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
And in every case that you have people take anything about their experience, and television series or anything, not series, but a television program that examines the paranormal and abduction experience and so forth, picks it up, they'll always misrepresent it. And this is over and above objections from the people that were actually involved. And the only show that never did that was the movie that fella that I really like, UFO Hunters, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's what
Mm-hmm.
the name of it. Now, what he tried to do is, as he represented someone who was an investigator, and he had a cynic who was a healthy cynic, a young man who was primed to ask him every question, every valid question that might ever come up about what they were doing, what they were finding, and what had been reported about it that got them interested. So it was an excellent show. And I think it could have really gone places if it had been allowed to continue. It wasn't allowed to continue, in my feeling, because it was kept pure.
So, do you think that hypnotism brings out false information sometimes?
Hypnotism is only as truthful as the therapist, the hypnotherapist. And like I said, whenever we're dealing with something that involves anything so close to what many people deem national security or national interest or whatever, which actually should mean the interest of a powerful group of men and women, when anything like that happens, I think that it is corrupted very carefully and given a bias away from the truth. And this is no different with the abduction phenomena. And I think that whenever anybody, any hypnotherapist, begins treating an abductee, that they're visited, if not already, this is set up. And they're told, if you want to stay in business in your field of psychiatry, psychology, or whatever they're in, you want to stay in that field and or can get this far, you want to live, you'll do our follow-up for us. And that follow-up is actually what it says. Because I think today, in most cases, abduction, they have nothing to do with ET and sometimes nothing to do with EBs. They're solely done by covert black ops for eugenic studies or to help build a controllable climate for the hostile ET thesis, which they intend to use to implement the New World Order in its final days of implementation.
What did you think about the movie Signs?
I haven't seen it.
That's the one where
Okay, it's the one that's made by.
the crop,
Yeah,
the
yeah. You're talking about Mel Gibson's.
Mm.
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, pure bullshit.
Okay.
Pure, absolute, unadulterated bullshit.
So why is it that there is this kind of the story that develops from the abductee story, especially when it's aimed at women? They try and convince these women that they've had hybrid children, because that's another meme that is pushed and pushed and pushed, that somehow or other they've created a hybrid child, either through abductions or some other methodology. But you know what I mean? That's another big lie that really needs to be addressed.
Well, we know that terrible things are being done to these women. They have all my sympathy, and I would never say anything to harm them or to hurt their feelings or anything. They have my sympathy, and if any of them want protection, I'll give it to them. They can come and stay with me. I'll protect them. I don't care if what I have to do to accommodate as many of them as need be, because they deserve protection. EBs will not come around me, and neither will these shits that are representing themselves in this way. But no, these women are being abused, they're being exploited, and their lives are not their own. That's horrible. They deserve our help, our concern, and the parts of the alternative media, especially the cottage industry, are exploiting them in a different way. That's all.
And they think they really have had these hybrid babies.
From what I've read, yeah.
I don't know who they'd be having them from, because they're certainly not having them from EBs. EBs have no genetic number. They're nothing but chunks of meat sewn together with a computer terminal. They have no personality. Ask these women, have they ever detected a personality? And that's not even in that mixture of what's going in their head during the sessions.
And I was talking to you earlier, Mark, about the group that worked on me for quite a period of time. The leader of that group was a woman who was older than me, probably in her 60s. And she told me her story. Part of her story went into depth about how she believed she'd been an abductee for a long, long time. And she told me that she'd had a child. So obviously, I don't know what was the truth and what wasn't the truth, but she came from that angle, you know, in order to suck me into this world, if you like. And whether she used that number on other women who'd had experiences that I hadn't had, who knows? But it's a mire out there. It's awful. It's really heartbreaking. And you just, how does somebody come back from that in their mind when they don't know what's really happened to them, what hasn't happened to them? I can't even comprehend it myself. I just feel for them. I really do.
I've interviewed 3 women on my show, and only one of them had conscious memory. They all had sightings, but only one of them really had conscious memories before the regression occurred. So it makes you really start to get suspicious that these regressions are producing memories that are not correct or not accurate or not based on reality.
Or that are placed in them.
Well, that's a possibility.
The second technology has the ability to induce false memories. They have the technology to create missing time, the missing time phenomena. And this was acquired with studies on the effects of radon gas. Radon gas will cause a person to lose time.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah, and tell you how they found that out. Because I talked with people that were involved in this. I was in Grand Junction for a while. I used to prospect, and Grand Junction was my base. I'd go into Utah and along the Colorado River in Colorado, not the Colorado, but the Gunnison, and had claims. One of the things that unavoidably came across, because where I operated from during the day was mostly Grand Junction Labs, which was run by a friend, John Kephart. And he was a very good chemist, and whenever I needed money or ran out of money, I'd go in there and work for him. I'd run his fire assays or do some titration or even run the atomic absorption unit, because he did a lot of water work for the oil companies. People would come in there, they'd bring in samples, and we'd talk, and a lot of them had been old uranium miners, and there was a big uranium mill right in the middle of town back during the 50s when uranium was a big deal. The industry was booming, and so were the prospecting and the sale of claims. They were all being sold to the government. So they had people that would go out in the field. After the uranium was concentrated, it would be put in a cake, and it would be put in the sun to dry, and people would go out and turn it with these wooden paddles. Well, they'd have to go out and tell them it was lunchtime. They'd have to go out and tell them when it was break time. They'd have to go out and tell them when it was time to go home, because they thought they just got there.
Is that right?
That's right. That's what radon gas does to you. So there you have the missing time phenomena. Now, I'm not saying that they use radon gas to simulate abductions. What they did was they knew that whatever part of the brain was being affected by this radon gas had to do with recoverable short-term memory. So if they could affect that part of the brain, they get the same result. So after tests and after the R&D that they did, they found a way to do it with psychotronics. And so psychotronics can remove the short-term memory of any experience. They also have a device that flashes light at a certain frequency and intensity that will knock you out, put you to sleep, bang, just like that. And in the 70s, there was a movie called The Scanners. And in that movie, the government has this hidden technology that they're using to do foul deeds upon the citizenry. And they have this device. This guy comes in, hits these people with that, and then does what he wants to, kill them or take what he wants or whatever. And they had that device then, just like in Rollerball. In Rollerball, which was made even before then, there's a scene at a party where this young girl runs out on a balcony with a laser burst gun, handheld laser burst gun, and starts shooting the trees in the distance, setting them on fire. They had one of those then. Really?
Now, how old is that?
Older than that.
That's 20 years old, isn't it?
Rollerball was made in the 70s.
So you're saying they have like a laser pistol now?
Laser burst weapon, yeah. They've had this thing since, that I know of, since 74. So it's earlier than that, I'm sure.
It's very interesting that we don't see that used anywhere in war.
You don't see it used, but it's been used.
Oh, it has been used?
Oh, yeah. Yes, it's been used.
Where do you think it's been used, or when?
Mounted on a simulated UFO.
Oh. Didn't they have some sightings of triangle craft in the Gulf War and things like that?
Yeah. They've had UFO sightings where these UFOs were decimating an enemy position in Vietnam.
In Vietnam?
Yeah.
Wow.
EBs.
You think they were EBs, or do you think they were secret government craft?
Well, you have to realize that, Phil Snider came in late. There were arrangements between covert black ops military and EBs back as early as Truman.
Truman?
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, I just had a train of thought I wanted to ask you about. And okay. The other thing I want to talk about, the real religious crowd, they want to equate extraterrestrials and fallen angels, and that whole thing drives me crazy. Could you comment on that?
We have this view, a mythology, that is based on a very recent work from the 18th, the time of John Milton, called Paradise Lost. And that's where you get all that horse shit. I often like to kind of play with the fallen host. Look at all the movies, look at all the secret societies and their malpractices that are based on John Milton's conception of a war in heaven. The fallen angels firing on the gates of heaven with a cannon. It hasn't become any more sophisticated since John Milton. And of course, it's just like Dante gave all these righteous demigod preachers hell to believe in, lakes of fire and all this. How insane is it all? It's hard for people, good people, that believe in the spiritual value, and things beyond the material. It's hard for them to cope without having to resort to one of these stupid examples, because they have contaminated the mind of so many people when clarity is obtainable. But of course, you can't get it from your public school system. You can't get it from your universities. How many people have read Edith Hamilton's mythology or The Golden Bough or anything that would help put them in a place free from all of this contamination? And that's exactly what it is. So we haven't aspired any further than Greek and Roman mythology, have we?
Yeah, what you're saying is so true. What bothers me is that once these people get these locked-in ideas, it's like a computer program that's caught in an endless loop. They're like in a mind prison, and they'll never be able to advance any farther in their conscious evolution.
Well, you take how this has helped. When the Zionists infiltrated the fundamentalist Christians and bred this Christian Zionism, you had not just mythology, but you had mind control operating on a very high key. What you had was you convinced these people that Christ was really a Jew. And, you know, Jews are God's chosen people. The Bible tells us so. Which Bible are you referring to? You're certainly not referring to the Wycliffe Bible. That is the most studied, greatest scholarly work ever done on the scriptures in the Greek and Latin texts. Not to mention the fact that there's an even better source for Christ than that, called the Dead Sea Scrolls, that have been suppressed and hidden for 60 years.
Yeah.
So, you know, let's try to really find out the truth here. And if you do, you'll find that these people are led down a primrose path that's full of mind control. If you tell people, well, the Jews are God's chosen people, so that means they are not. And of course, once you understand this, then you know that Israel has to get away with anything, because until they rebuild Solomon's temple, then until then, we won't have the second coming. And so, you know, the Jews, it's hands off for them, right? So these people worship Zionism. Although they can't be a Jew, what can they be? They can be a slave to Jews. They become servile to Jews. Not just Jews, Zionist Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, people that began from a tradition of opportunism, people that weren't Jews until the Pope said, oh, well, loaning money is heresy. Loaning money and you'll be excommunicated. And then the Inquisition will get you. So what these people do? Oh, I'm a Jew, so I can loan money. And, you know, that's how the Rothschilds got started. It's how they aspired to take over international banking. It just kept on and on and on until now. They are the IMF. They are international banking. They are the Illuminati. Illuminati work for them. 2 million thugs and punks and criminals that you have under sway.
Are you familiar with Kenneth Copeland?
Oh, yes, I am. It's a monster.
It's
a monster.
Do you know recently he bought a $20 million Learjet?
He has a mansion here in Fort Worth out on Eagle Mountain Lake that will rival the Taj Mahal. He is located on an old Army Air Corps base that is bunkered with a series of tunnels that go all the way up to Carlsbad and from Carlsbad all the way to the Pacific. He is responsible for being the front for Air America since it left Mena, Arkansas, when the Clintons took the White House. Every day, Chinooks fly over my house, just about every day. I'd say at least 4 times a week. Chinooks. Now there's 2. They fly over my house heading out there with the heroin. He has these bikers rallies, and these aren't mom and pop's bikers. These are Banditos, Hell's Angels, and so forth. They're distributing the heroin for him. And they're out there. They have had one incident after another. One incident where a little girl was killed. Another incident where a black helicopter that was loaned to them by the sheriff, who was Copeland's former chief of security, David Williams, loans him this helicopter to run counter surveillance because the government was getting too close to nosing about what was going on. And so they were running counter surveillance, and it crashed out there on the property. I was being watched at that time by Kenneth Copeland's brother, Ted Copeland, who was a narc in the Fort Worth police. And he was living right across the street from me, shacking up with a woman who ran off her husband and kids to shack up with him. And to watch me. And when that helicopter crashed, I walked over and confronted him. And his, whatever she was to him, left within 10 days. And that was the second time they'd been in that house. They'd put it on the market once before.
So you live pretty close to Kenneth Copeland then?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't.
Okay.
Where I live is in line from where the heroin is flown, Bell Helicopter, and his and Kenneth Copeland's property, his old Army Air Corps base.
Maybe some people that listen to this later won't know this. I just want to say this. Kenneth Copeland is a very famous television evangelist, correct?
The biggest. The biggest.
He recently purchased a $20 million Citation Learjet, and I think he has an airport on his property out there that has 4 airplanes. So you're telling me he's involved with smuggling drugs?
He is the front for Air America. Air America brings the heroin in from the Golden Triangle and now Afghanistan too. This was at Mena, Arkansas.
My goodness.
Bush Sr. put it in there with Bill Clinton when Clinton was governor. Everybody in Arkansas knows that.
Wow.
And whenever Clinton got in the White House, they felt it incumbent to move it elsewhere. So they moved it down here, and Kenneth Copeland became the front for it.
Boy, wouldn't his congregation like to know that?
They're involved in it. I bought a trailer from one of them, and they were telling me how I should join the church.
You did?
And that they invest in, what did he say? What did he call it? They invest in something or other. They make investments, and they always make profits on it, and they can live there and all this other stuff. And they were moving out there, so they sold this place to me in Newark. Newark is the closest town to where he's located. It's also interesting stories about Newark.
Okay. Can you tell us a little more about this Air America? Is this the CIA, the NSA, or?
It was the CIA during the Vietnamese War. They made a deal with the Montenegro, the mountain people in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It's called it the Golden Triangle because all this opium this is what those people did for a living. So they made this deal. If you'll be friendly to our side versus the NLF and the Viet Cong, we will market your heroin. And of course, where are they going to market it? They're going to market it in America. And that started it, and there's been plenty written about it, Air
Right.
America. Well, I have a book on Air America.
I've heard of it before, yeah, definitely.
And this book, you won't find in any list or whatever. Supposedly, it's never been published.
Now, how did you find out that Kenneth Copeland was involved in all this?
I lived out there. I saw it. I see them fly over my house 3 or 4 times a week going out there.
So you saw the helicopters just streaming in, huh?
There was a gentleman that was running his audio-video lab out there. His name's John Seidler. John Seidler was a true believer.
Mm-hmm.
And so John Seidler was married to a very pretty lady. And one of Copeland's lieutenants took her away from John. Just took her.
Mm-hmm.
And so John, of course, quit, and he started using his skills.
Wow.
I met John at meetings that I would go to in Dallas that were constitutionalist meetings back when Bogarts was speaking out against what was going on before 2000. And people were alarmed, and they were afraid there were going to be house-to-house search and seizure operations. And people were finding out about the New World Order. They were finding about a number of things. And so I would go to these meetings, and I met a lot of people that had a lot of information and had a lot of things that they could back their information up with. And so over that period of time is when I became aware of certain things that had been going on out at Carswell, certain things that had been going on out to where we're talking about. And later on, I met the man who was vying with Kenneth Copeland for that property before Kenneth Copeland got it. And he was a farmer Pinkerton. His name was Bill Johnson. And Bill Johnson was on his way out to sign a contract for that land. He knew the owner of it. And on the way, he had an accident. Supposed automobile accident. But of course, his automobile wasn't damaged. Well, he lost his short-term memory and was in the hospital for about 6 weeks. And when he got out, Copeland had the land. His son, Bill Johnson, had 2 daughters and 1 son. And his son started investigating. and got murdered. So this is interesting. Well, Bill is coming in. I was setting up a flea market. Bill would come in.
Is that right?
He was getting rid of his little spy cameras and stuff that he had used as a Pinkerton. I was on really friendly terms with him. So one day he comes in, he's upset. And I said, why are you upset? And he says, I keep getting these dreams. And he said, I think I know that my son was murdered by somebody. And I said, do you really want to remember, Bill? Will that make you feel better? And he said, yes, I do. And so I helped him remember. And when I did, he jumped up and he said, I'm going to see some people. I'll see you later and let you know what's going on. Well, I didn't see him for 6 weeks. And when I saw him next, his daughters brought him in. And they told me, they said he had another accident. And this time he can't even remember the streets in Fort Worth. He grew up here.
Oh.
And Bill was in his 60s.
Oh, my.
So I didn't do him a favor, did I? But then there are other stories. I can tell you a ton of stories. Kenneth Copeland is responsible for the murder of 5 people I know. Kenneth Copeland, his thugs kidnapped my wife.
Oh, my God.
At the time, little German girl. She was gone over that night, and when she came back, she was never the same. We broke up, and she would call me up in the middle of the night after we were separating and while we were getting a divorce to try to tell me about these dreams, and these dreams involved she'd be put on something that was spinning and there would be these colored lights. And I said, you know, I'm familiar with that device. And she said, what is it? And I said, it divorces you of all emotion. She said, oh, really? I said, yeah, that's right. You don't have any feeling for me, and you don't have any feeling for anybody you're going to come in contact with ever again. Oh, you'd be surprised. Mind control is the only fucking thing they spend money on. Except war.
My goodness, what kind of technology is this?
Don't you think we're going to have some things?
Really? You know, James, you know so much. I mean, I don't know how you got the... that's crazy, man. It's just crazy.
Well,
goodness sakes.
I didn't know at the time. Let me tell you the scenario. My wife and I had a little bit of a stormy relationship, but things were starting to get better. And so she loved to fish. I was carrying mail at the time, and I came home. We had planned on going fishing over the weekend. This was on a Friday. So I come home. She's nowhere to be found. Night comes and goes. So I'm getting ready to go to work or go into town. I think it was my day off or Sunday. And she shows up and starts accusing me of messing around on her. And the fact that I'm always there, and all of a sudden she's gone for 2 nights. No calls, nothing, you know, out of the blue. And so I slapped her, which I regret. But it just, before I even thought, I slapped her. She jumped up and ran off, and then she would call me. But, you know, never discuss what happened or anything else. So she went through a lot of changes, and of course she wasn't the same person, and we never got back together again. But while we were going through divorce, I would go down to this little bar that was down just below where Kenneth Copeland's is. It's walking distance away, and a slough comes in there from Eagle Mountain Lake, and a little creek used to be there called Squaw Creek. A lot of stories about the area, but there was a bar there, and I go in there and have a few beers and play poker. I mean, not poker, but pool, shoot pool. So one day I was in there, and this guy was saying, didn't you have a wife that was German? And I said, yeah. And he says, you know, I saw her fishing one day over there where this bridge was, that enough of that slough came in there that you could catch crappie there. And I said, yeah, that'd probably be her. And he said, well, she was there, and then this limousine pulls up, and 2 men get out and just grab her and put her in the back seat and leave everything, leave her car, fishing rods, everything. And he said after about 2 hours, that limousine comes back, and they pick up all of her stuff, and one of them drives her car. And I said, you ever see those guys before? And they say, yeah, they work for Kenneth Copeland. So I tried to get him to figure out when that was. And he said, well, it was on a Friday. And that's all he could tell me.
Great.
Put it in the month or whatever, but we couldn't get an exact time. And I asked other people, they hadn't noticed. So, that's how I kind of extrapolate what happened to her, because we were on very good terms before all that happened.
How bizarre.
I mean, I have a history. And of course, people know. And I've had people come by my house and sit down and ask me about things that could have only had access to my military record. And I know that a couple of these young men were CIA. And the reason that I know that is something that I told them became a big part of something that happened later. So, and again, that's an extrapolation, of course, not absolute proof of it, but I don't believe in proof on this planet. Proof is something that liars use to try to tangle up truth seekers and slow them down.
Mm-hmm. Myrid, have you heard this story before?
The Kenneth Copeland stuff, yeah, I've heard bits of it. It doesn't surprise me.
And the only reason I brought it up is I recently found a little interesting clip on YouTube about Kenneth Copeland and his Learjets and how he's being investigated by this, that, or other group from the government or whatever. And I played a few clips just of him, just because he's such an exaggerated example of what you might call religious corruption or whatever. And I had no idea.
God wants you to send me $200 and make a prayer offering, and it'll be returned to you 10 times.
Exactly.
Let me tell you this. I went down to see an agency of the government in the federal building here in Fort Worth to talk about Kenneth Copeland. And they looked at me like I was crazy. It didn't contradict me, didn't act like what I was saying was wrong or anything. They just acted like, I really don't want to hear this.
Right.
So I had a customer when I was in the flea market, a guy that was an avid collector of Mexican Revolution memorabilia. And I had sold him a lot of what he had. And at the time, he was head of the Tourist Bureau here in Fort Worth. He had been the city manager of Fort Worth. Name was Doug Harmon. And I said, Doug, what do you think about Kenneth Copeland and what he's doing out there? And he says, we don't like it. The feds will have to deal with it. And when I was going through a divorce, I showed up for a hearing. It was just a procedural hearing. And it was in the county court. And this bailiff, when I walked in, this couple was leaving, and this bailiff shook his head and he said, you'd be surprised how many times drugs have something to do with why people are here. And I said, yeah, that's my case too. And I said, you ever heard of this little church out on the Jacksboro Highway? And he says, yeah, I know all about it. And this is what he said, the same thing Doug Harmon said. It'll take the feds to clean that up. Hell, the feds are doing it.
Wow.
Oh, man, you'd be surprised how many times I've had it out with feds, FBI, ATF, DEA, because they're all so full of it. You know, if they don't know, they're cannon fodder for the next exercise. That's the way it is. I probably saved several lives of DEA, FBI, and ATF.
You said the next exercise. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm talking about the siege in the Davis Mountains that my ex-wife and a former friend of mine were involved in, where they intended to kill them all. And because I called in and said, you know, don't kill anybody, and I'll keep quiet about what I know. And if you'll talk to Agent so-and-so, he'll tell you that I know a lot. That was a big deal. Sometimes if you want to read about it, just type siege in the Davis Mountains into any search engine and see what you get.
Wow.
The woman is my ex-wife, my last ex-wife, Evelyn. She sometimes would go by Evelyn McLaren, which is the name of this former friend. Or sometimes she'll go by Evelyn Horak, whatever frame of mind she's in at the time.
Isn't it kind of strange that your ex-wives get involved in these very crazy, bizarre circumstances.
When you are in my shoes, and the shoes of Alex Jones, and the shoes of David Icke, and the shoes of a couple of other people I won't name because they are alternative media sensitive, they get to you through your women. And if they don't get through to you through your women, they get rid of the women, at least from you. They're vindictive.
What do you think of Alex Jones and his whole show and operation?
I think that former colleague of his that he tried to ruin because the guy asked him, is your wife your Zionist handler? And Alex Jones went after him tooth and nail. Put him out of the business.
Was that Mark Dice? Or?
I think so.
Okay. So you're thinking Alex Jones maybe has some support from the Zionists?
No, I don't think he has support. I think he has one of their monarchs for a wife who is Zionist. And he doesn't ever, all that he goes on about. How many times does he take aim at Israel?
Not often.
And of course, if I was really concerned about the biggest, gravest travesty on the planet, which would be Gaza, I would be really alarming people about that. And he is, Bill Cooper was right when he said that Alex Jones is an alarmist. And when you're really trying to get something done, the boy who cried wolf is just a little antithetical to getting it done, isn't it?
Yeah, I've always thought it's strange the way he's just always just trying to stir people up and never really, he doesn't focus on so much communicating of information, but just getting...
No, just enough to sell himself and to make people think that he is the cat's meow. He's all that they need for their information, you see. So that's all you get, right? That's what they call a gatekeeper.
Do you think the elite have put him in place?
Yeah, and I think he was Bill Hicks.
He was.
I don't believe in that much coincidence.
Bill Hicks, explain. You lost me there.
The comedian. They have the same face. They have the same teeth.
Oh.
They have yeah.
You think they did it?
One, it's kind of like when you're talking about Shakespeare and Philip Marlowe. One pops up and the other disappears. Yeah, right?
So,
well, in Shakespeare's case, Christopher Marlowe, I said Philip Marlowe, I mean Christopher Marlowe and Shakespeare are the same man. And that's been proven by computer analysis of the last play Christopher Marlowe wrote and the first play Shakespeare wrote. The computer says the same man wrote both.
So you're saying that the elite changed the identity of this comedian, Bill Hicks?
Yeah. Yeah. They're perfectly capable of that. He was dying of pancreatic cancer. And they told the poor bastard that we can keep you from dying. We have second technology that'll save you. But you have to do this for us. And we will throw in a monarch butterfly. That's what I think. Now, I am more than extrapolating. I am reaching. But that's what I think.
Very interesting idea. So Alex Jones has been a victim of MKUltra then, right?
No. He just, he wanted to live. No, they have mind controlled him. He made a bargain with the devil to live, and he's keeping his part of the bargain.
So he knows about what you're saying, essentially.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure he does. What did he do? He went after Bill Cooper. If there is anybody, premier in the alternative media, that I would trust, it's Bill Cooper, who is now dead. Bill Cooper didn't have any agenda other than the truth. The truth. And I know that he was involved with disinformation. Everybody is. I am. Everybody is. Snowden is. When Snowden walked out of the NSA, he grabbed everything that wasn't nailed down he could carry.
Mm-hmm.
And with it was disinformation. It wasn't his disinformation. It is what that they use on their own agents. That way they can determine who's leaking anything that a whistleblower puts out.
Do you think the elite have put Alex Jones in place in order to potentially stir up a civil war?
No, I think that he's just a gatekeeper. I think he keeps it contained to certain things that are permissible, certain things that are not too damaging, or, of interest enough that they stir up controversy, but they're not going to be resolved. And then we'll go to the next thing or whatever. He's a gatekeeper.
So he's kind of a distraction for the public?
Well, a gatekeeper is someone that keeps people in a frame of mind that, this may be true or that may be true, but we'll never know. And all this, and, there's some bad things that are going on at Bohemia Grove, but we don't know for sure that they're actually sacrificing babies. No, we don't know that for sure. They're just burning a bonfire in front of a 60-foot owl, right? Uh-huh. Yeah.
Are there gatekeepers in the UFO community?
Oh, many of them. Many of them.
Can you elaborate on that?
Many. Most of the published ones. I'm somewhat of a ufologist myself, and I could write a book on ufology that has a lot of firsthand direct information in it. It'd never be published. It doesn't matter how good it was, or how hard I researched, or the effort that I made for quality and produced a proofread copy. It doesn't matter. It would not be published. But then some idiot like Jerome Clark would. He's published 5 or 6 books, and they're all shit.
Yeah, I've often wondered.
He's the little pinhead that said, I was a protege. Get this, a protege of John Keel. But then I found out that John Keel made things up. BS. Look, Jerome Clark makes things up. John Keel would go out into the field and he would ask witnesses and people that had experienced very, very close encounters. He would ask them firsthand and listen to what they had to say, not put words into their mouth and direct the interview like Clark does, and 90% of all the other so-called published cottage industry ufologists. Why hasn't ufology gone anywhere in 60 years? That's why.
What do you think of J. Allen Hynek?
Mr. Hynek was given a position when he took over Blue Book. He was a scholar. Mm-hmm. He was very interested, and he visited my great uncle. And he really knew that there was a connection between what my great uncle found in ufology. And he was as honest as the government would allow him to be. He knew that there had been men killed for varying from the strict confines of a security oath. And he wasn't going to be one. So as far as Hynek concerned, he was a mixed bag. I think he was as good and honest as he was allowed to be. But still, he was at best a gatekeeper.
I was never that impressed with Jacques Vallée.
No. Jacques Vallée found a couple of things out that other ufologists have not found useful. But they should have, just like American ufologists avoid ever discussing Colares. Colares is the biggest UFO event in history.
That's Brazil?
Colares, Brazil, in the 70s. And it went on for almost 3 months. And while it was going on, a military detachment was sent down. The officer in charge drew these vehicles. They watched the base they were using on another remoter island. And this entire village of Colares, every single person in it practically, was probed. They weren't abducted, they were probed. Even the doctor, there was a lady doctor there. And she thought these people were going through hysteria. I mean, there's no explanation why they would, but that's what she thought until she was probed. And they'd be walking out at sunset or night, and this light would hit them and just freeze them. And they would be probed. Sometimes a little biopsy sample would be taken from them.
Why were ETs probing these people?
Well, it's good that you asked, because I'll tell you. These were ETs from very, very far away. They knew that Earth was a confused mass of sentient beings and didn't understand why and wanted to find out, see if they could do anything about it. They weren't members of the local extended community, but another. And so they came in and did a precise job, took the time that it needed, and one of them contacted the lieutenant and told him, we don't mean any harm. And this lieutenant, many years later, just about 3 years ago, came forward. And he contacted these Brazilian ufologists, gave them all the materials that he had, all the information he knew of, told them about that contact, and gave them drawings. And this caused the Brazilian government and military to release all their files to Brazilian ufologists. There has been disclosure in Brazil, and that's why these little pinhead ufologists in America don't want to recognize it, because the work has been done for them elsewhere. And their egos and their cottage industry interests of making money would suffer. They are not interested in the truth any more than the people hiding it.
It is a weird situation in ufology right now. To me, the idea of getting disclosure from our government is so strange because the government is so corrupt right now.
Not in Brazil. This is one of the things that makes Brazil unique. But in the United States, there have been people murdered. There have been lives ruined. There has been one shenanigan after another pulled on experiencers and abductees and witnesses. And so, if there were disclosure, there would be so many people caught up in criminal charges that, the list, you couldn't draw up a big enough list in 3 days. That's the kind of criminal activity has been involved in suppressing the truth. And it has been an ongoing thing. And not just in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, NATO. NATO has been the warehouse, the international scene warehouse that most of this is integrated through. And there was a sergeant that I went to hear one time. He was a master sergeant, and he had been involved with NATO. He had found out a number of things, a number of procedures, processes, protocols that were used by NATO for recovery of vehicles, of ET vehicles, or EB vehicles rather, because very, very seldom do ETs crash. And if they do crash, they make every effort to recover their people. And not like EBs. EBs don't give a damn. Because after all, they'll just make some more.
I've been too busy reading this moon thing and tracking up all afternoon.
Oh, man, this is the best presentation for hoaxing the phony moon landings. I mean, and he puts it in a perspective no one else does.
That's great.
Which is really good. And, he shows how it was used by Nixon to divert people from the nasty things that he was doing in Southeast Asia.
And you're talking about Dave McGowan's Wagging the Moon Doggy?
Yeah, I sent a copy. I sent a link to James so you to have a look.
It's excellent. It really is excellent.
I was telling Myriad about how Neil Armstrong, when he first tried the lunar module, he had to bail out and it crashed and burned. And then they reconstructed it, and they never tested it again until they got on the moon.
Oh, I know. They couldn't control it at all. In fact, it was being demolished every time he came down. And then all of a sudden it just works perfectly. But he goes through everything that they would have needed. They didn't have room. And the rover would not fit on that. And they claimed they folded it up. Well, if you look at the pictures of the rover, there's no seams where it could have been folded up.
Yeah. Plus it's huge. It's enormous.
Yeah, it's just, it's preposterous. I'm finishing with it now. I'm towards the very end. On every topic, he points out the anomaly. All these people that are devoted to debunking the hoaxers are absolutely absurd. They remind me of Phil Klass. And,
Phil Klass.
Yes, he was the in-place debunker of ufology. Every time that there was any special on mainstream television, there would be two guys. There would be Stan Friedman and there would be Phil Klass.
Yeah.
It was a gatekeeping show to see because, Stan Friedman wasn't going to advance ufology at all. He was made to look like he was the great defender. And if you bought into that, then you said, well, it couldn't be any more to talk about, right? Mm. There's plenty to talk about, and Stan Friedman wouldn't go there. I had conversations with Stan Friedman twice.
Did you?
Yeah, one lengthy one on the phone. He had worked at Convair or General Dynamics and been there at critical times, and yet he didn't know fuck. And so I'm asking him because my stepfather worked there for 35 years. My stepfather was a really unusual man. He could do anything he wanted to do. He put his mind to it, he'd master it. He came back from the war in the Pacific. He had jungle rot and he had malaria, both. And he got through that. At one time, the VA wanted to amputate his feet. And so I remember my mother using boric acid, washing his feet and using wool socks and all that stuff. I remember and how it smelled. He was a great guy. We lived in a little town. There was no work there. So he would drive 80 miles to Fort Worth and 80 miles home every day to work at General Dynamics. It was Convair. Started out as Consolidated, Convair, and then General Dynamics. And he had pins from some of those pins are worth a lot of money. He went from a tool planner right on up to being an engineer, and General Dynamics wanted to send him to college. And he said no, he'd rather work, and he worked on General Dynamics built some of the ICBM sites, and he worked with those. He came back. He was extremely well respected. He was placed very high in the B-58 program, knew all kinds of stuff, and never talked about it except when, he felt like it was okay. But he did say that what disgusted him most, after they had perfected the B-58 delivery system, this would be the first time you ever heard about this. After they had, guess who they invited to come over and see what it did and how it worked?
China?
No.
Russia?
This was, the Soviet Union. This was during the Cold War, and they bring all the big brass over to see it. And that's when detente started, because what they showed them antiquated any kind of hostility between the Soviet Union and the United States. They showed them the delivery system with a modified B-58, hauling ass with a neutron bomb. And that was it. That ended the discussion right there, and so they went into detente. And detente was actually, secretly, detente began whenever the United States, with the help of a gentleman that was very instrumental in the Soviets getting the tractors they needed for their 5-year plans when they were collectivizing farms, Hammond Arman. He ended up with most of the Fabergé eggs, actually. But that's another story. But once the Soviet Union got the hydrogen bomb technology, which was shipped to them by the U.S. military under orders from the White House to do so, then the Soviet Union and the United States could cut the world up into pieces of pie and share it. That's exactly what was behind that. And then finally, once that they could envision peak oil would come, they decided that they needed all the oil in the Middle East. And since China and Russia both wanted to keep interests there, had interests and wanted to maintain them, even had bases. The Russians had a base in Syria and have one now. So since they wanted to keep their toe in the water too, that's when they started the bullshit to break up the Soviet Union, which they accomplished. The final nail in the coffin, of course, was the nuclear reactor accident at Chernobyl, which was caused. It was instrumented by Gorbachev under orders. And the first issue that came out of any length on that, which told the full story, was in National Geographic, which you can't find that issue unless you go into secondhand bookstores or whatever that have back issues of National Geographic. You may find it. It has an aerial view of the reactor as it is burning, and then it has a 30-some-odd page article on Chernobyl and exactly what happened. And it tells you that this group of men came under orders from Gorbachev and took over the control of reactor number 1. And they ordered the reactor fired up full and then ordered the cooling system offline. Nothing happened. And then they ordered the backup cooling system offline, and of course the inevitable happened. And that was the final nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union. It brought it down.
Wow.
Because you see that what was behind it, Gorbachev was a trilateralist. He had been educated in the United States, spoke English as well as we speak it, but was always represented as having a translator and an interpreter, and that is bullshit. He was a trilateralist, and of course he was always on good terms with Kissinger, Shevardnadze, Brezhnev, the whole 9 yards. I mean, these were the monsters that after the Soviet Union fell, overthrew a legitimate elected democratic government in Georgia with a lot of bloodshed. There was a special that was made for one of the PBS or the Discovery Channel or one, I can't remember exactly, that had a video on that, an extensive video on that. And at the same time, they had, while this team was there, of journalists and cameramen, they made a video or a movie or whatever you want to call it, documentary, on searching for red mercury. And this is something to see, because there had always been rumors that red mercury existed. This is a way to make a hydrogen bomb without heavy water. And it would enable anybody to exploit, a third world nation without much resources, to exploit that technology in a cheap and practical way. And of course, that was a great deal, quite a revelation. And so if you hunt for those documentaries today, it's just like the documentary that I include in one of the articles I wrote for UFO Digest. You try to find them, you can't find them. You go on and try to find the archives. I tried to find the archives of every potential site that would have had it, like the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, PBS. And the same thing with National Geographic. If you go and try to find that issue that was within a year of Chernobyl blowing, you won't find it. I had a copy of it out in my garage. My hot water heater blew and got that box wet. So at the time, I didn't appreciate how dire the situation could come in trying to have things like that to show to people and demonstrate that you weren't all wet when you brought these things up. And it had mold and everything. And so when you have mold on books, you better throw them away, because that'll spread to other books. And if you have any in the vicinity. So also I had a first printing of a first edition, a London version of Byrd's biography of his second expedition to Antarctica, which is where he talks about their flying over this one area, and the plane and crew, everybody gets abducted, and they're taken to this valley. He meets the blonde elder, and they have a chat, and then they're restored back on their trip. Yeah, he talks about that, and that's been removed from Byrd's diary, and you have members of Byrd's family that'll say that. I've talked to one of them. So, but in the next printings of the first edition of that book, that's been removed. So you got to find the first printing of the first edition, London edition of that book. It's not in American editions or anything, which I had. And that's another one of those books in that box. Stupid me. I never thought that a hot water heater could blow, but these were dual element hot water heater, guaranteed for life and all that bullshit. Well, what happens is you've always got one of those heaters burning. So that water's going to be steamed, and it's going to blow it eventually. And that's what happened, because you cannot get those burners to regulate themselves. So you always got one of them going, so it's superheating that water. The thermostats don't matter.
James, I want to go back to this whole B-58 Hustler. I would like to do a whole show on the B-58 Hustler sometime and get some clips together, and we could play those and talk about this. But this B-58 was an amazing thing. I've always thought it was an amazing thing. Its first flight, I think, was in 1956, and it was a Mach 2 bomber back in 1956.
Mach 4.
Really?
Really. And that's at low altitude.
See, that's different. That is different than
that was everything we're talking about was classified then.
Wow.
It was classified. You had to... The structure of the plane itself, the wing structure, was composed of a metal which was like aluminum, only much stronger, and the support in between was provided by a form of epoxy they called honey. And my stepfather brought a piece of that home one day. You know, the wing, piece of the wing, a little piece. You could hold it in your hand. You wouldn't feel it. You wouldn't feel the weight of it. No, you couldn't feel the weight of it. It was about 3 inches long and about 3/4 of an inch thick. It was shaped like a tip of a wing, only very small. And, of course, it had these strands of the same metal, and then in between the strands was this epoxy they called honey. I took the hammer to it one day. Didn't mar it at all, just to see.
Wow. Now, the B-58, it carried a nuclear weapon.
No.
In a large pod underneath it, didn't it? No?
It had a pod, not a Bombay.
Right.
What's the difference? There's a difference. I've seen a picture of the pod on the runway by it. General Dynamics had a paper that came out every week, I guess. I don't remember exactly. But I've got that paper that has a picture of it on the runway with the pod by it. The difference between a Bombay and a pod is a Bombay drops a bomb. Pod doesn't.
The pod is released, right?
No. No. It's not released. That's the difference between a pod and a Bombay. It wouldn't be a pod if it released the bomb. Would it be a Bombay?
How does that work then?
You drop a neutron bomb, you're not going to survive. Nobody on the planet's going to survive. Why worry about getting away from it?
So it was a suicide mission.
Yeah.
I mean, did they plan on flying that B-58 in at low altitude, is what you're saying?
We're talking about after the Vietnam War.
60s.
No,
yeah,
we're talking about when they modified it.
Oh, okay.
And I think that it was pilotless. They had the avionics to do it.
Back then?
Yeah, sure. They had the avionics towards the end of the Vietnam War. That's why they were sending in Delta teams to recover the avionics out of some of the planes that had been downed.
Gosh. It's so sad. You know, the public is in the dark about everything. We don't know anything. I mean, we get this BS, you know. They tell us they retired the B-58 in 1970 and that it was a Mach 2 bomber.
No, here is what they did. They modified the B-58. Then they built these tunnels from General Dynamics down south. And these tunnels have openings. They modified the B-58 so it would take off on a shorter runway. And they have back behind trees and hills and everything. At one time there were 3 of these places. You'll be driving down to Stephenville. Stephenville is about 70 from General Dynamics. You'll be driving along and you'll see a little guardhouse and you'll see an open gate and a cattle guard. And then you'll see a dirt road that winds around and goes behind these trees. And every once in a while, if you're lucky, you'll pass by, you'll see planes coming out up behind there. Helicopters, planes, whatever. And these are associated with this particular runway that's there, short runway, maintenance or whatever that they're doing. But these are points of launching one of these. They're going to hit Carswell. You know, Carswell is one of the prime targets in a nuclear war. So it's going to be hit. So these places are removed far enough away not to be damaged by a direct hit on Carswell. And so what they do is they operate immediately. These things take off, fly low profile so that they're under radar and at tremendous speeds. And it really doesn't matter where they detonate because everybody's gone.
Didn't the B-58 have these little escape capsules that were supposed to be for the crew, where they could eject at supersonic speeds and not kill themselves?
Yeah, well, all your fighters, bombers, interceptors have them. They're just an ejection sheet. The cockpit canopy is blown off with a small charge, and they eject. And then there's attached to the seat that the pilot is belted into is a parachute. It's on all the military planes, whether they're attack or bombers or interceptors, they all have it. And they've had it, as far as I know, since the Lockheed Starfire.
Now, didn't a lot of people hear this plane make its supersonic booms there in Texas?
Oh, yeah. That was a period of time when people were upset about that, and they didn't think that any of these jets ought to fly that close to, that low. They shouldn't break the sound barrier within so many miles of a city or whatever, but they did. And, of course, they were all excused because, these were protecting America, weren't they, and all that horse shit.
I don't know if we talked about this last night, but they sold our newest version of the F-16 to Iraq, which I thought was kind of humorous. Isn't that a joke?
Well, anytime that the military-industrial complex is making money, no matter who they're selling to, it's cool. Because where does the money go after all? Money goes into the coffers of the elite that are the only ones that own controlling interests of these corporations involved. And they don't give a damn about lives. They don't give a damn about nations or whatever. They play off nations against nations. They create war. And that's just the way it is, Ultimately, these are the people that caused 9/11. Ultimately, they're the people that made the attack on the USS Liberty or ordered the attack. And, of course, they have their claws into the people that would be in their way, like in the case of the USS Liberty. LBJ condoned the sinking of the USS Liberty because it was inconvenient to Israel. It was on a fact-finding or surveillance program for the NSA. It was a USN ship, and it was surveilling what was going on with Israel pirating freighters that were taking plutonium waste to the Atlantic Trough.
And how many holes did they shoot that ship full of? The Israelis, they came over that thing.
Oh, they killed, I think, 30-some-odd men. They were going to sink it. They were going to kill everyone on board. And LBJ went along with it. He ordered it.
One of the aircraft carriers there was wanting to send F-4s over, but they stopped it, didn't they?
The only thing that stopped it was a NATO ship of another country that came into it, and they stopped it. Or they would have sunk it and killed everyone. They intended to. They wanted to blame it on Nasser or someone else, They wanted to start another war in the Middle East and bring the United States into it, just like they did with 9/11. Every time that you find something like this happening, Israel's Mossad is involved, if not instrumenting it, like 9/11. And, there's so many strings dangling that all tie to Israel on that it isn't funny. You get a list sometime of everyone that profited off of that.
Off of 9/11?
Yeah, like beginning with Silverstein.
Yeah.
Made $4 billion off of it. He didn't own that. He was leasing it. Yeah, he still made $4 billion off of it.
He was leasing it. Oh, my God.
Yes. Well, since then, if you follow Dmitry Kulesov's work, Dmitry Kulesov was in a branch of the KGB that was monitoring the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty Agreement. which required all nations that were members of that treaty agreement to report any use whatsoever, peaceful or defensive, of any kind of nuclear device. And so when those buildings were built, along with the Sears building in Chicago, they were installed with nuclear devices for controlled demolition. As they fell, the mass would be particularized so that it wouldn't damage surrounding buildings, at a minimum at least. Those buildings were installed with what Dmitri says, 0.165 megaton devices. And Dmitri Drew, when he began writing his book, The Third Truth, he wrote about the zone in which these buildings would be reduced to very fine particles. And, of course, he drew it out right up the towers and, of course, right up to the top 3 floors, which all fell intact. Also, on Building 7, which was also installed with the device, it was the terminal that these devices would operate. They would be brought in place on a little rail from Building 7. So Building 7 had an armory right catty-cornered across the street from its corner. A corner of that armory is within that zone that Dmitri drew. And this is before he knew what I'm going to tell you. After 9/11, that corner of that armory was condemned, and eventually the building was pulled down, and they rebuilt it, or some other building. But everything about Dimitri's claims, including the iron spheroids that are in that dust and all this other stuff, supports nuclear detonation. Now, thermite was used too. Anything to throw people off, anything to confuse matters, and it probably did help guide the fall of the building, using thermite to cut those support beams. Because those support beams are massive, and people don't understand that. If they did, they would see the folly in buying into the official World Trade Center report that was done, because it's just BS.
Myra, do you ever feel like when you're talking to James, it's almost information overload, like you're drinking from a fire hose? I'm way back on the B-58. Just trying to wrap my mind around all this information. It's very, very fascinating.
Well, the B-58 technology served the elite to place the Soviet Union in a position where they had to comply with their world domination plans. And it was very profitable. And the leaders of the Soviet Union at the time, the way they thought to preserve their system and to put behind the massive expenditures that they had to make on their own military and on their defense. So they had no idea that there would be a point where they would have a plant come in, Gorbachev, who was misrepresented even to many of the leaders in the Kremlin, and who instrumented the fall of the Soviet Union, virtually single-handedly.
Well, let me ask you this question, James. We got this war going on in the Ukraine right now. Didn't Chernobyl actually occur in the Ukraine as well?
Yeah, that's in the Ukraine.
So, is there any significance to that? That the fact that the Ukraine keeps popping up? What are your thoughts?
The Ukraine is a source of problems, has always been for the Russians, because of what they term the White Russians. And, of course, what we see today is that we see the worst element of the White Russians that are slaughtering anyone that opposes them installing the regime that is modeled after that of the Nazis. Only it doesn't have any saving grace to it other than just barbaric, murderous killing. I mean, they operate on the same basis as mercenaries and ISIS and everyone else, Installing terror is the key element of their offensive. And by terrorism, I mean a war on civilians, a war on the innocent, a war on those that can't fight back. The way that they were going to hold elections, the fact that they wanted the Crimea If it hadn't been for a stand that Putin took, they would have slaughtered people there too, because most of the people in Crimea are Russian-speaking. Well, they don't speak Ukrainian.
Sorry to interrupt you again, James. Maybe you can tell our listeners, the people that will listen to this MP3 later, a little bit more the story around the whole Ukraine. Now, the Ukraine, I know, we got the Ukraine, which was formed in 1991. They became independent of Russia. And then we've got, is it Crimea, the southern peninsula in the Ukraine. And now Russia's invaded that peninsula. Can you tell us why have they invaded? What's the whole story there?
They came in at the request of the Crimeans. These people were mostly Russian-speaking. They didn't identify at all with what was going on in Kiev, and most of the Ukrainians don't. The traditions, which harken back to Nicholas I, have had a lot of contention between the Russian rule over these regions. And this is just traditional. So at the time of World War II, at the onset, Stalin was willing to sacrifice all of the Soviet soldiers whose loyalty he doubted because they were white Russians or they were Ukrainian. And so he made plans that put them in a situation where they didn't have the loyalty that was applied to the rest of the army divisions. And when Hitler invaded Russia, or the Soviet Union, in Operation Barbarossa, he found most of these army divisions just came over to him. Well, he didn't know what to do with them. There's so many. And so a lot of them ended up as prisoners of war. A lot of them ended up eventually in gulags. And, they didn't fare well. Most of them were killed. The Germans felt about them the same way that anybody would. How do you trust a traitor? So, there's so many things, so many realities that people don't take in consideration, even when they write books about this period. Deutscher wrote a book on Stalin, and at first I took the Soviet side over the German. So I was much opposed to Isaac Deutscher's book on Stalin until certain things came out about one event, and that's the Caton Forest Massacre. And so when that came out, I began to see that it couldn't have been the Germans that killed all those Poles, slaughtered 20,000. And most of these were intelligentsia. They were officers and professional engineers and so forth in the Polish army. And when I could see the evidence that the Germans didn't do it, but the Soviets did it, and this accounts for, at the same time that Hitler is coming into Poland, invading Poland, Stalin's coming in from the east to get his chunk of it. And that's left out of war history, you see.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And, most of these people, because, the Polish resistance to the Blitzkrieg was just nothing, really, no more than the French. So when that happened, most of this group of men, these 20,000 reservists, they fled to the east. And, of course, there's Stalin, and he took them. He put them in prisoner of war camps and then murdered them. Stalin's nice little touch. If we really knew the truth about so many events that took place in World War II, we wouldn't be so quick to judge the Third Reich as the sole evil of that war and of that period.
I agree with you totally. And today, I'm trying to get my mind around this whole Ukraine crisis. And there was President Yanukovych. He was basically thrown out of office by the Ukrainians, correct?
Well, he had been duly elected, but he was corrupt, and that's just the way of the world. We look at what we call representatives today in the United States, the senators and representatives, for the most part, they're traitors. They're corrupt. They go along with things that they have sworn not to. They have sworn to defend and protect the Constitution. And now they backslide on that constantly. They can be led into any kind of situation as long as people are making profits. And they're going to get kickbacks in the form of contributions, campaign. It's rotten. It's rotten. So if you're going to criticize Yanukovych for anything, I mean, apply the same standards to our own. Do you know Cynthia, what's her name, a black representative?
Cynthia McKinney.
Cynthia McKinney came forward and just flat stated that, the reason I don't have any money for campaigns is that I wouldn't make a pledge to support Israel no matter what they do. Yeah. And then she went on to say everyone that has a seat in the Senate, everyone that has a seat in the House of Representatives has to make this pledge or they're not going to get any money. Where's this money coming from? It's coming from the billions of dollars that the United States gives each year to Israel, channeled back into AIPAC, which is illegal, and AIPAC bribes these people in the Senate and in the House of Representatives with it.
So,
oh man, it's incredible. It's incredible. You can't speak out against Zionism in the United States if you're in Hollywood as an actor or in the Guild, or if you're in the Senate or House of Representatives. They got carte blanche. And sometimes do a little investigating on how many of these representatives and senators have dual citizenship in the United States and in Israel. Just do it. That's illegal. That's illegal.
Now, let me draw an analogy here with the Ukraine. The Ukraine's about the size of Texas. We've got Yanukovych, who was a corrupt president, who the people threw out. And now we've got Russia coming in, taking over the Crimea.
They didn't take over the Crimea. What they did is they came in and prevented the Kiev group from exercising the military invasion of the Crimea, which is what they were going to do.
Okay.
Along with, Chechenian rebels, Blackwater mercenaries, CIA, ISIS, if they needed them. Who knows? Who knows? As long as it's funded, it's done, isn't it?
I see, when I look at Ukraine, I look at Russia, I see two very intelligent, hardworking groups of people here. I don't really see a bad guy per se.
There is none. There is a different ethnicity. You have the Ukraine, they want independence. They don't want to be another Russian satellite or anything, and that's all over. Russia doesn't want any satellites. Russia doesn't need it. But they have people, like in the Crimea, most of the people are Russian-speaking, so it's like anything else. You protect your own, don't you? I mean, when there's a chance that they're going to be slaughtered. Bear in mind the behavior of these monsters in Kiev.
Sure.
I mean, that was what I was just about to say. Plus, somebody's been in there for a long time, instigating and stirring up extreme Nazi-type groups, white extremists. That's been going on for a long time throughout that area, and even in the Balkans as well, because that came up around about the time of the football. It was the World Cup. Not interested in sport, but I just remember there was a documentary on about that. So it's been bubbling under the surface for quite a while. So they just, whether that's been CIA and doing that, probably, but they stir up old history and old resentments. You see what I mean? They go in there and they monopolize that.
Which group shot down the Malaysian airliner? Does anybody know? Who shot down the Malaysian Airlines Flight 17?
The so-called Ukrainian rebels.
Okay. Now, are the Ukrainian rebels... Why don't you tell us about them? Exactly who are they? Are those the people that kicked out the president?
Yes. These are the people who are avowedly Nazi, or fascist, I should say. They are the leftovers of the collaborators in the Ukraine that ran the extermination camp right outside Kiev in Babi Yar. They were people that didn't mind executing anyone that didn't think as they did, just like these people. I mean, these are the descendants of that way of thinking. And, of course, they delight in being able to opportunize a situation. Putin was warned if he and China did anything to stop the takeover of Syria, that this kind of crap would happen closer to home. And, of course, this is what's behind it. Only the person, it was a Saudi prince that said, I control the Chechenian rebels, and I will put them on you. And so Putin laughed in his face. But this is the kind of thing. And Obama, of course, not getting his way. You know, he's not able to satisfy the schedule that has been set up to take over all the nations in the Middle East and put them under the umbrella of the United States. You know, do the same thing. Loot them, along with international bankers.
Let me throw this out to you, James. I don't see Putin as the bad guy in this. Bad guy.
If you really want the truth, the only thing that's standing between us and a police state right now is Putin.
I probably agree.
Maybe China. Well, let's look at what they thought they could do with China. They thought that if they could be such heavy debtors that China would play along, because once the petrodollar went down, all that money, all those American dollars they have would be worthless. So they had to play along with, oh, hell no. The Chinese were the first to break with the petrodollar. They started printing currency backed by gold. I mean, if the truth of the American dollar was known, it would fall tomorrow. But when they did that, then nations like Syria and Iran would say, yeah, we'll step out of this OPEC understanding, and we will sell as much of our oil as you want for your gold dollars or for your gold currency. Oh, yeah. Wouldn't you?
Wouldn't you agree that the United States shouldn't get involved in this at all?
At all. No, I would absolutely agree. I would say this has caused all of these problems today. You know, to vilify an entire ethnicity is one of the most dangerous things there is on earth.
I agree.
I had a person call me up, and he was hysterical. And he said, ISIS, these jihadists are going to take over the world and all this stuff. And I told him, look, so that's not true. I said, if you want an aggressor in the world, it's the United States. It's not any nation in the Middle East. It's not any group of people. ISIS is a CIA fabrication. Al-Qaeda is a CIA fabrication. You know, once it gets going, you got enough psychopaths involved that they start eating people's liver, crap like that. You know, that doesn't look good. So all of a sudden, you've got a president who has been responsible for most of this, who says, I've got too many fires lit. So all of a sudden, you're hearing about, well, we got to do something about ISIS. We can't support them. I mean, they're really giving us too many black eyes. So, I mean, we have a group of people in Washington, D.C. that think they can get away with anything. And as people wake up, they're put further and further into a corner where they say, well, the only way out is World War III or, you know, Ebola, a phony Ebola epidemic so that we can put poison in people's arms that'll eventually kill them, or drive them into FEMA camps where they'll be killed. You know, I've said this over and over again now for years. You go into a FEMA camp, you're not coming out alive. And that's absolutely true. That's what they're there for. That's why the coffins, that's why if you look at the buildings that they've got that can be converted over into a FEMA camp, you'll see these look like skylines where you can put the chimney of a furnace that you're going to burn people in, burn their carcasses.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's all over the place. It's in your face. And people that don't want to see it, you know, all they have to do is go out and look for themselves where there are FEMA camps. If you'll look, the barbed wire's on the inside, this razor wire, to keep people in. Now, if this was an emergency place to house people that had lost their shelter due to storms or whatever, or that there was an epidemic or whatever, why would you need to make prisoners of them?
I've heard that there are 800 FEMA camps. Is that correct?
There are 800 FEMA camps and probably more coming, but there are a number of buildings that have been built that can be adapted. They'll have a barracks-like looking outside, and all they have to do is put up the wire, put up the fence and the wire, and they're a FEMA camp. We've got one here that's supposed to be a school, and yet you never see school buses over there when the school would be not let out. You don't see kids. You just see a lot of cars. And so we know that it's not a school. Why is it represented? Just want to hide what it is. And I would bet you that Homeland Security has a number of offices in it, that FEMA has a number of offices in it, and they just don't want to make it easy for you to put the puzzle pieces in place. But that's what it is. I mean, depopulation is a subject all of these monsters talk about. They intend to make it a reality because as we become more aware, they become more and more threatened. That's why all of a sudden, I don't have it in place for depopulation yet, so let's have World War III. That'll do it. Yeah, it'll do it for all of us. World War III will get rid of every mammalian life on this planet in the first week. And it doesn't matter how deep you go into the earth. Look how they have fractured the crust of the earth. How can you trust any construction that you might have as an underground city to house the elite? And, you know, I know people that have billets for these places. And they told me, well, we'll get you one. I say, screw that. Screw that. Screw you.
I've got some interesting executive orders here that I'd like to read. Maybe you can comment on a few of them. Executive Order 10990 allows the government to take over all modes of transportation and control of highways and seaports. Executive Order 1099 allows the government to seize and control the communication media. Executive Order 10997 allows the government to take over all electrical power, gas, petroleum, fuels, and minerals. And listen to this. Executive Order 10998 allows the government to seize all means of transportation, including personal cars, trucks, or vehicles of any kind, and total control over the highways, seaports, and waterways.
Well, you have a tyrant in the White House that thinks that he can make law with his pen. They have another constitution they want to put in place. Everyone that supports this that has held or is holding public office is a traitor, guilty of high treason. And the penalty for high treason is death. You know, where we got into the mode, the attitude that a person can have too much power to be brought down and held to justice, and that banks could be too big to fail, and on and on and on. You know, we have nothing as free men and free women if we don't have justice that is enforced equally on everyone. We have nothing. We have nothing. And that's what we have today. We have nothing. We have an illusion of freedom. We have an illusion of the guarantees the Constitution gives us as a social contract. And if we don't stand up and say, look, our only agreement with you sons of a bitches is this social contract. You broke it. You are out. That's what we need to do. We need to stop participating, as my friend Crystal says, in our own demise. Because as long as we don't do that, we are.
On that note, James, Crystal, should we maybe press save on this recording and then meet again at 5? Isn't Crystal going to join us later?
Yes. Crystal is our colleague, very apt, very intelligent, very capable, very focused, with a moral core second to none. You know, she is my celebrated colleague. Marit is my celebrated colleague. Shuni is my celebrated colleague. Torzi is my celebrated colleague. I'm a very fortunate man. How many excellent friends that you absolutely trust do you have, Mark?
Probably not that many. I'll be honest.
Well, I'm rich.
Good for you. Hey, Crystal, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good. So last time, earlier this afternoon, we were talking about the moon landings, the B-58, Chernobyl, Bird's expedition in the Ukraine. So maybe we should let Crystal choose which one of these she wants to address, or something else, if something else is more exciting right now.
Would it be bad if I said, can you say the list again?
Sure. We talked about the moon landings, the B-58 Hustler, which is a really cool plane, Chernobyl, Admiral Byrd's expedition, the Ukraine, and we talked about 9/11 a little bit too. So.
Well, those are all really good topics.
What about the moon landings? I love the moon landing. Love to talk about the moon landing.
The moon landing that never was?
Yeah, there's definitely some fakery going on there, but I don't know. I'll let you guys decide where you want to draw the line and all that. On the last show, I brought up the fact that the lunar module crashed the only time they tested it on the Earth here, and then they just built a new one and threw it in the rocket and went back up to the moon, and everything magically worked okay. So that's a strange thing that happened. Another strange thing is if you look at their suits, somehow these suits were able to withstand a change in temperature of maybe 200 plus degrees in the sun to 200 minus degrees.
That's 1,000-degree variance.
1,000-degree variance?
Yeah, when they were in the sun, it was 256 degrees Fahrenheit, and when they were in the darkness, it was 256 degrees minus Fahrenheit.
That's quite a variation.
Yeah, it is. And, of course, it's all phony. I mean, there's no way. There's nothing more ludicrous in the world than the people that try to debunk those of us who can see it and smell this hoax a mile away. There are so many things that contradict the reality of this, and I've been reading one of them by David McGowan, who has put together the best analysis of it I've read, and I'm on part 6. He's got it down. Anybody, after they read this, those that want to debunk the people that are showing proof that this was a hoax, anybody who wants to go with the debunkers who just doesn't know how to read or it doesn't read well, assuming they're honest, because it's just like saying, well, if we try hard enough, we can climb Mount Everest with emphysema.
Well, let's talk about some of the things that are strange about the moon landings. One of the things I've heard is that when they initially broadcasted this, that there was a Coke bottle that showed up in one of the scenes there on the moon.
Well, yeah, the earliest broadcast hit Australia.
Yeah, exactly.
And there were people that saw the descent from the lander. As his foot is being placed down, you see a Coke bottle. And, of course, analysts that have pointed the hoax out also point out that the people responsible for making this phony landing have intentionally, some of them, have intentionally left clues. A rock, supposed to be a moon rock, with a plain C on it, which is a prop rock.
Yeah,
and just one thing after another, but Stanley Kubrick is supposed to have participated in that. It haunted him for the rest of his life. People point out clues in some of his subsequent movies. There is The Shining, for one. There are a number of attacks on the validity of the moon landing that you can make, and in every case, there are just multiple anomalies that cannot stand up to scrutiny and do anything but challenge the validity of the moon landing. And one of the things that people, even Mr. McGowan, who I say has put together the very finest analysis of it, the moon landing was used by the Nixon administration to divert the American public from the escalation that he was creating in the war in Vietnam and carrying that war into Cambodia. So it served the purpose very well, and that's one of the things that Mr. McGowan points out very well. But the one thing that's left out of all the analysis, and once you understand how this was used as a part of social engineering, you have to understand what the technology was at the time as opposed to what it is today, and that without being able to actually conduct any exercise close to an experiment to replicate the conditions on the moon as opposed to those on Earth, that there is no way that the administration and NASA under its wing would have taken a chance of a failure. And this is replete with the probability of failure. from start to finish. And it just boggles the mind that people can't realize that today. And one of the things that's at the very first part of Mr. McGowan's presentation, which I'm on the 6th part of, which I'd like to read. This is an extract from the very first. And this attaches to the mindset most people have that don't want to address this objectively. Quote, "But that is not the main reason that people cling so tenaciously, often even angrily, to what is essentially the adult version of Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy. What primarily motivates them is fear. But it is not the lie itself that scares people. It is what the lie says about the world around us and how it really functions. For if NASA was able to pull off such an outrageous hoax before the entire world, and keep that lie in place for 4 decades, what does that say about the control of the information we receive? What does that say about the media and the scientific community, and the educational community, and all the other institutions we depend on to tell us the truth? What does that say about the very nature of the world we live in?" Couldn't say as well myself. Could not do it. I mean, this is a great writer, a great mind, and he puts it all together. And, you know, I don't care what side of the fence that you wish to be on. Mm-hmm. You owe it to yourself and to your chance of survival in the years or in the months ahead to read this and realize that official versions of everything of import in the world today is probably just, pardon the expression, a sack of shit.
James, when we get you back on Revolution Radio, you'll have to tone it down a bit, I think. But no, you make a good point there. Even the aluminum foil.
Oh, it's supposed to be gold foil.
Yeah. The aluminum foil on the lunar module is so thin. I mean, you could literally, they'll even admit it, they could have accidentally poked their finger through it.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was for show. It would have cost them a great deal to actually have anything. And, of course, what I read to you is what they relied upon. They relied upon people protecting their comfort zones over common sense.
Wow.
They did. And that's why this charade, which any person who actually knows much about science, not necessarily astronomer, but just science, who is looking at this, they're going to be perplexed. I know that when I saw this, I was sitting in one of these Rush courses, Russian, at school. And the instructor was a lady, Госпожа Reisling, and she was really something. She was Russian. She brought a television set in so we could watch the moon landing. And I'm sitting there, and of course it's black and white, and, you know, we don't have a really good connection, so you couldn't tell any of this. The reception wasn't good enough to really show the shadows, how they were cast, or anything else. But I kept looking at it and thinking, you know, it just doesn't make any sense. And, of course, years later, when I went to Utah and had experiences there, and the first thing that occurred to me is how people were denied the tools necessary to see this objectively. So I don't look at it solely as a matter of incredulity. I look at it, too, that we just didn't have the means at the time that this went on. And then once this was sold to us, we had a predilection to make us feel good about our country, make it feel good about technology, that there was something besides just warmongering behind technology. And that was the important thing. So we all kind of clung to that until later on when people that were closer to the phenomena began to point out these incongruities.
Well, I can remember being, I don't know, I was probably 8 years old or 10 years old when the first moon landing occurred, and I was shocked because the flag was waving on the moon. And I pointed that out to my parents, and they got real angry at me.
Oh, I know. Well, you were challenging the trap they had fallen into to want to believe it so much that they would argue for it against common sense. Now, at the time, you didn't have the tools because nobody had the kind of television resolution that was watching this to really see that there was absolutely no dust on those pods, that there was no crater underneath the rocket cone. None. To me, later on, whenever I started listening to people that were far more attentive to this than me, later on, when they started pointing this out, that convinced me right there. And then as I became more involved in what I had my head stuck into, my life was like you're growing up, you're trying to conform, and you're trying to fit in, and all of a sudden a hand reaches out, grabs you by the nape of the neck, and puts your head in the commode and flushes it, then pulls it out and say, how did you like that? Now wake up and think.
That's probably how the people are going to feel when they start to wake up to this thing, because I think eventually this is going to come out. Now, maybe a whole generation has to die off before the public really realizes it. I don't know.
We have another thing that we need to come to terms with, and Crystal is working on that now. And that is the truth about World War II and the Third Reich. How that was manipulated, how it was exploited, and then how many lies were told afterwards to vilify the German people. Crystal and I recently together saw a movie that's over 5.5 hours long that presents an alternative view to that whole sorry episode in history. And it challenges what we've been taught. It challenges the conceptions of what was going on at the time and who was responsible, absolutely responsible for the situation in Germany to develop that would nest a Hitler and look upon Hitler as a savior. And, of course, in many ways he was. And this is the last thing, of course, that a interested party that has too much control and too much influence in this country want any of us to understand. And I'll turn this over to Crystal now. She'll tell you what she's up to.
Well, actually, before we get to that, I did want to discuss some additional things about the moon, because there are things that NASA has known about the moon for a very long time that they have not shared publicly. And I think that if they had shared it publicly, that the public would have questioned what they saw much, much earlier. There's an article on my blog called Odd Things NASA Knows About the Moon. It's a snippet from my first book, which isn't available anymore. And these came from a book written by David Hatcher Childress called The Anti-Gravity Handbook. And he was very kind in allowing me to include this section in my first book. And this section is called 11 Things That NASA Discovered About the Moon That You Never Knew. And James can actually probably add some more details to some of these, but they're very, very interesting. And the first one is the puzzle of the moon's origin. Scientists have offered 3 major theories to account for the moon in orbit around our planet. All of the theories are in doubt and none satisfactory. NASA scientist Dr. Robin Brett sums it up best. It seems easier to explain the non-existence of the moon than its existence. The puzzle of the moon's age. Incredibly, over 99% of the moon rocks brought back turned out upon analysis to be older than 90% of the oldest rocks that can be found on Earth. Other rocks turned out to be even older, 4.3, 4.5, and 4.6 billion years old. And the area that the moon rocks came from was thought by scientists to be one of the youngest areas of the moon. The puzzle of how moon soil could be older than lunar rocks. The mystery of the age of the moon is even more perplexing when rocks taken from the Sea of Tranquility were compared to the soil in which they rested. Upon analysis, the soil proved to be at least 1 billion years older. This would appear impossible since the soil was presumably the powdered remains of the rocks lying alongside it. Chemical analysis of the soil revealed that the lunar soil did not come from the rocks but from somewhere else. The puzzle of why the moon rings like a hollow sphere when a large object hits it. This is a little questionable, but it says during the Apollo mission, ascent stages of lunar modules as well as the spent third stages of rockets crashed on the hard surface of the moon. Each time these caused the moon, according to NASA, to ring like a bell or gong. One of the Apollo 12 flights, there were reverberations lasting nearly an hour to as much as 4 hours. The puzzle of the mystifying Moriah on the moon. The dark areas of the moon are known as Moriah and are, strangely, located almost entirely on one side of the moon. Astronauts found it extremely difficult to drill into the surface of these dark plain-like areas. Soil samples were loaded with rare metals and elements like titanium, zirconium, yttrium, and beryllium. This dumbfounded scientists because these elements require tremendous heat, approximately 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, to melt and fuse with surrounding rock as it had. The puzzle of the moon's strange magnetism. Early lunar tests and studies indicated that the moon had little or no magnetic field. The lunar rocks proved upon analysis to be strongly magnetized. This shocked scientists who had always assumed that the rocks had some very strange magnetic properties which were not expected. Explain where this magnetic field came from. And then there was another interesting source that David Hatcher Childress referred to. It was a book called Moongate, Suppressed Findings of the U.S. Space Program, the NASA Military Cover-Up, by William L. Bryan, and he was a nuclear engineer from Oregon State University. Of significance in Bryan's book is that the equation of the moon's gravity being 1/6 that of Earth's is nonsense, and that the true equation has not only been hidden from the general public, but the true equation means that the true fuel requirements based on the moon having a higher percentage of gravity reveals the startling conclusion that if men really landed on the moon in high lunar gravity conditions, it was not done with rockets. Bryan points out many obvious things that indicate a higher lunar gravity, including the fact that images of astronauts on the moon show them able to jump no higher than 18 inches. But of course that would be referring back to the staged film again. But these were things that I already knew about the moon, anomalies that I knew about the moon, before I met James. And so, having looked at this, to me it was clear that we had been there, because we knew too much about it, things that you could only know if you had been there and taken soil samples. But having looked at the way in which astronauts were said to have been there and combining that with this particular information, I've never believed that we got there in rockets, because there are indications that it's not even possible. So this was one of these strange holes or anomalies in our reality that James is the first person I have ever come across who can fill. And he's explained many, many times, we did go to the moon, but the only way that we can get to the moon is with an EV craft.
The point you brought up about the moon's gravity is very interesting, because you would think that if the moon's gravity was quite a bit less than the gravity of the Earth, that the astronauts would have been running around like bunnies. They'd have been going in fast motion, not slow motion. We see them kind of move real slowly, like they're underwater. But in fact, it would have been just the opposite, correct?
Well, McCowan explains what you see as the way in which the camera is slowed down.
Yeah.
And it makes all the sense in the world. Now, the suggestion is, and the truth is, that the gravity on the moon is artificial, and that it is created from machines that are inside the moon, because the moon is a sculpted craft. And the rare elements and minerals that are common on the moon have already been mined elsewhere and are part of the makeup of that sculpted craft, because your ancestors used it to come into the system. The first place around Mars brought Mars to life. And then when your ancestors messed up on Mars, similar to what they had done in their original system, it was brought to Earth, placed around Earth. But because of its inconstant mass and the disproportionate size to any ideal moon around Earth, it has to be kept in orbit artificially, and the use of those machines and engines on Earth do it. And this will explain the anomalies attached to variances that are reflected in pattern on Mars, or on the moon, and on Earth conjointly. And these are variations in the magnetic field and in gravitational field. And so these are two different things. What's the difference between a magnetic field and a gravitational field? Magnetic field is going to affect beyond the immediate area. It's going to affect objects around it. Gravitational field relates to basically the mathematical equation of mass times density. But in reality, none of these things remain constant. So this action accounts for why, and this is a long-time anomaly that's never been addressed publicly by scientists, why the moon and Earth have an inconstant gravity wave.
Let's step back in time a little bit. I'd like to go back to the time that the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, was constructed in Egypt. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how Egypt fits into this chronology that you're describing of humans coming to Mars and then causing some catastrophe on Mars and then eventually coming to the Earth. Can you tell us, to me, it seems like all of the artifacts in Egypt, whether it's the Great Pyramid or some of these incredible sculptures that exist, which I'd like to talk about in a little bit.
Which are mirrored, in a way, by what you find on the plain of Sidonia on Mars.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. It seems to me the people that built these structures in Egypt were at a higher level of advancement than we are currently. Correct me if I'm wrong.
They had taken more of the right path towards technology and unified consciousness. What's on the plain of Sidonia was built as a monument of what had been there, so that it would kind of touch off an awakening, a memento of the past. And when Earthbounds had reached a point where they had the technology to venture beyond their planet, would be kind of like a waybill for finding out about their past and maybe reconstructing a technology and an approach to science and civilization that could aspire beyond just Earth and therefore become something besides Earthbounds. Everybody out there calls you guys Earthbounds. And there's a reason for that. Earthbound humans, and even your own kind that went somewhere else during the Great Exodus, called you Earthbounds.
So Sidonia on Mars is kind of a mirror image of what we see in Egypt, or should I say vice versa?
Yeah, in fact, what inspired the patterns of the city building, the monument building in Egypt, was taken from that legacy. There are pyramids in Egypt that are far older than the Egyptian culture you see today.
Oh, sure, of course.
Yeah.
I think they're like, my personal opinion is right around 73,000 years old.
That's a good guess. That's pretty close, yeah. That's pretty close. They were built towards the end of an extinction. You've had 6 extinctions here. You've had one that was more advanced technologically and even socially than yours today. But yours has done more damage to the Earth than all the others put together because you have a sickness, you have a disease that has exercised influence and control broadly and widely through international banking. And that's not in common with the other extinctions. The other extinctions occurred over just misapplication of technology because people are, when you had your own system, you were so ruthlessly independent that you wouldn't join an extended community and take advice from people that could have saved you devastation. You're like that here. There are ETs that have sat down with presidents and world leaders here to discuss averting what is going on now. And, if you don't promise your world leaders technology, make things even worse, then they're not interested in your wisdom.
And there is something else I would like to point out about what you were just discussing, Mark, about the pyramids.
Mm-hmm.
In my early research, because I'm a pattern person, I'm always looking for patterns, and one of the patterns that stood out to me right away is that the farther back you go, the more technologically advanced we were. And this, of course, flies in the face of it completely defies what has passed for logic in terms of humans evolving from apes, doesn't it? And it also lends a great deal of validity to James's claims about us having come from somewhere else. And there are also past life regression sessions that verify what he said about our past. And it also explains where the moon came from, which is something that NASA has been grappling with, unbeknownst to the public. So I think that this is very important. Sentience is a very, very special thing. I don't know if James would like to maybe explain that a little bit more, but I think that there's a mindset that runs the planet, and it's constantly trying to encourage us to devolve, if that's even the right word, considering that we were more evolved in the past. But it's very debasing, and reducing us to intelligent animals or monkeys, I think, is very much part of that. But we were a very great people once, and I think that it's really time that we reclaim our true history. That's very important. But sentience is and this is something that I never really even thought about until James began to discuss it, but it makes a great deal of sense in that sentience isn't evolutionary. I don't know if you maybe want to comment on that a little bit more, James, because I think it's really beautiful.
Well, sentience comes from one place. When I was a kid, I was always trading my books, and I traded them for some geology books and archaeology books, and took them home and stuck my nose in them and tried to make sense of them. I noticed that there was this, maybe they were a little older than what was current at the time. I don't think so, but there was still this belief in parallel evolution, that blacks evolved and then Mongolians evolved and that Caucasians evolved. We all are brothers and sisters. We develop over time in different environments through natural selection, and natural selection is one of these things that people get up on their high horse and say, oh, you're talking Darwin and all this crap. I'm not. I'm talking about something we see every day. What happens in all that natural selection is, and I'd like to just take a minute and explain it. Natural selection is that when your environment changes radically, then there are certain types of people with certain traits that are going to do better in this new radically changed environment than others that don't have these traits. They're going to reproduce more, they're going to be more successful, and eventually they will become the dominant type. That doesn't mean militarily or through hostilities or anything. It's just a fact of nature that these people have more ability to adjust. That's natural selection. That's all that it is. You see it in birds, you see it in ducks, you see it in all animals. The sparrow in industrial England, eventually the sparrow became darker and darker to be less of a target for the hawks in the background of the ash and the gray that was on the buildings from the soot of the industrial production. So this is a fact. You know, I'm not talking about something that hasn't been studied. This is natural selection. What I'm talking about is that the differences in humanity here is not caused because that race of people evolved separately. They don't. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is a mathematical certainty that that's not true. So take an Eskimo. An Eskimo is smaller in stature. He has the ability to contain body heat because he has less skin surface area to dissipate it. You take Africa. These people are longer in limb, they're taller, they have more surface area to dissipate the heat, which is a good thing for their environment, you see. I mean, on and on. I mean, there's certain people that have really thick earwax and certain people that have very thin earwax because thin earwax protects you from the cold and giving earaches. And thin, keeps your ears from becoming compacted with this earwax. So when you start thinking about these things and seeing these differences, this parallel evolution BS just flies out the window because it is mathematically improbable, if not impossible. You know, it is a current belief among many, many civilizations that all sentience comes from the same place. And we change, and this promotes the idea of the universal kind of brotherhood. It's a good thing. And once we understand that, then we stop looking down on people because of ethnicity so much, or because they're different color, they have different traits or whatever. The mix, the genetic mix, is at its best with variation. The universe has a consciousness, and it rates variation, variety, or whatever very, very highly, and is constantly wanting to experiment to find something new and see if it's better. And that isn't because they're going to remove the weak. No, we'll give them something to aspire to. You know, there's so many ways we can adapt. The individual can adapt. It doesn't take generations.
You said something very interesting there about a universal consciousness, and I agree with that. There is universal consciousness, and it's not anthropomorphic.
No.
It's not a human-like God that's depicted as angry or jealous, and it doesn't get involved in human warfare.
No, as a matter of fact, one of the things that I find so quaint is that people want to make a God that has a human-like personality and is to be feared and to be this and that. I see that there is something above me, something beyond me, something I will never understand. And there's a reason for that. It's the same reason that E.T. cannot enter an EMV or even go near it. That there is a distance to be maintained with something grander, with something more powerful than you that has a benevolence, is the most wonderful sorting out mechanism to remove hostility, to remove bigotry, to remove the idea of military conquest over others that there is. And it keeps the civilized part of the universe going. Keeps it civilized, keeps it growing in good ways, accommodating ways. You have people coming in through this area constantly trying to figure out what the hell is wrong with this planet. That's what happened at Colaris. You know, the concern, it is natural for sentient beings to be concerned over other sentient beings, especially those that are in the plight we're in today.
Well, I want to step back to Egypt for a minute because there's our physical evidence, in my opinion, that there was a higher, more advanced civilization in our past. I don't know if you guys are familiar with these two particular monuments. They're called the Colossi of Memnon. There are two massive statues. One is 60 feet high. They're both 60 feet high, and they weigh an estimated 720 tons. They stand in Thebes, Egypt. And just to put that in perspective, 720 tons is 1,440,000 pounds. And these statues were said to have been transported 420 miles over land. So, to me, there's more evidence than just the Great Pyramids in Egypt that there was a very, very advanced civilization there. What do you guys think?
Well, the Colossus of Rhodes is even more remarkable. Of course, it was lost at the same time the Mediterranean was created.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell us about that more. Do you have any more information?
Well, the Great Flood, the one that supports the notion of Noah, was when the ocean broke through and fed the Mediterranean. That's in relatively recent times, you know, about 32,000 years ago.
32,000?
Yeah, it's recent times. You guys have been here on Earth for, roughly 270,000 years.
How many civilizations have risen and fallen in that 270,000 years? 6?
6.
6?
Yeah, and one of them was ahead of yours, technologically and socially.
Mm-hmm. Also in Egypt is something called the unfinished obelisk,
Yeah.
which I think is the largest known ancient obelisk. It would have been 137 feet high, but when they were quarrying it out of Aswan in Egypt, I think there was a crack that appeared, and then they abandoned the project.
Yeah. There are two forms of art among the megalithic monument builders, and one of is to edify Pharaoh or a dynasty, and the other is to edify a god or goddess. And sometimes these two things get mixed up and come together, and you have, again, the same tendency the Greek and Romans had, and going back to the Babylonians and other cultures even older, is to try to apply a human personality to a god or goddess. And, of course, that's juvenile. That's absurd. It's kind of like trying to draw a caricature of a person, combine the features of a cartoon character and apply them to a person. It's just absurd. And so, it's not even funny whenever it's a god or goddess. But that's what they did, and the Greeks were much more closer to being primitive than the Romans. They named everyone after animals. Really. When they performed, they had little theaters, and when they performed, the actors would always wear masks that made them appear twice their normal size. And, here's that actor down there carrying around this chunk of wood that weighs 35 or 40 pounds. Don't you think that was... Those guys and those ladies had to be really tough.
There is one other really important point that I don't want people to overlook in the context of what we're talking about, because not just our individual thoughts and perceptions, but our thought patterns have been managed for so long that we rarely deviate from those patterns. And one of the patterns that is very heavily ingrained in our civilization, which I think has a tone of debasement to our history and our culture, is that when we go back and we look at an advanced civilization, what's the first thing people say? Oh, it must be aliens, right? Aliens must have done that. But in fact, we are going back and digging up the remnants of ourselves.
Exactly. We're not from here.
Well, when we were on Mars, we excavated Mars to look for former civilizations there. In one of Kevin Smith's shows, he found an excavation, and it was our excavation of society and peoples from earlier times. People just don't stop and think. We have so many anomalies in archaeology that people don't ever stop and think, this civilization was doing archaeological excavation, and although this is an anomaly and doesn't fit in with theirs, this is something that they found from an earlier find. And I've never come across anybody that conceive of that, and it just amazed me. Down in Central America, they have something of a dump yard from an old museum that goes back to a former extinction, or to a society that extincted. And this dump is full of these terracotta statues of military apparatus, like a Cobra helicopter, like doctors and nurses wearing the garb, just one thing after another. All would fit in with our current society perfectly. And there are tens of thousands of these little figures there. I went down to see them.
They threw them away?
Well, when the extinction occurred, somehow that museum was built in such a way that it survived, or these terracotta statues, figurines, wouldn't have survived. And so eventually, somebody dumped them out on the ground and kind of got buried. That is the explanation of why they're there. And the people see these things and they can't figure it out, oh my God, because no one wants to really take the giant step and to see that when you find these things like a spark plug in a coal mine from 3,000 feet down, that these things have meaning, that they're not just out there to be talked about and forgotten, that they point to a past of high technology that existed a long time ago.
Well, let me make another giant leap forward. I want to talk about the elongated skulls that seem to be associated with some of these monolithic structures and megalithic structures. Were the elongated skulls related to the civilization that came here from Mars? Or what's your take on the elongated skulls?
No, they didn't come from Mars. There are people that have that feature. And some were in early dynasty in Egypt, and that's responsible for the fashion of the headdress of the pharaohs. They were considered to be extremely wise, and so they were way ahead of the Egyptians or anybody on Earth in understanding genetics, and they knew, since the Egyptians found that these people were so wise and so advanced and looked up to them, they followed a pattern that was set by this family. And that was, they understood that the offspring from a union between a son with his maternal aunt and or a son with, or a girl with her fraternal father is more apt to produce a copy of that particular person than the way that we go about it, a man and a woman from a different heritage. And so they did that. To be Ra, son of the sun, to be in the royal line, that's what you had to be. Therefore, the Jewish idea of Moses being Hebrew is just pure BS, because they kept very close records of who was in that line. Moses was a pharaoh. He was Akhenaten. And all the 33rd degree Masons know that, and so do the Illuminati, and, you know, this is the kind of knowledge that marks their secret societies, and they make them feel superior and all that crap.
Do you think the people with these elongated skulls had more cranial capacity and maybe more powerful brain in some way?
No, they had unified consciousness. They had access to genetic knowledge and collective consciousness because of unified consciousness. And your ancestors had it too. And these people weren't any superior intellectually. They came from a more advanced culture, and they tried to share some of that. They showed the monument building could be done better if they used a particular kind of concretion and used molds. And so that's how most of these pyramids subsequently were built.
Were the people with the elongated skulls more closely linked to Cydonia?
No, they came from somewhere else. They came from way out. The people that are connected with Cydonia, your ancestors. They would look just like you, only they had unified consciousness until they came to Earth.
Now, when you said these other people came from way out, do you mean beyond Earth?
A minimum of 100 light years away.
Oh. Well, Crystal, I'm going to let you take over here because this sounds like new material to me.
Oh, well, you know, we did a show on this some time ago, not just the elongated skull people, but also the cone heads. Because there were cone heads here as well. There have been a lot of different kinds of peoples here trying to coexist with humans and not doing very well. Like we were discussing earlier, it reminded me of that quote, "Gods don't kill people, people with gods kill people." There was a lot of that going on, and a lot of them didn't survive it. There may still be peoples here that we've not discovered, and until we get our act together, for their sake, I hope it stays that way. The Earth also has a history from before we arrived here. I think that's very important to take into consideration also, because there are histories that we may have come across that are not our own histories, that may be spliced in with some of the other fairy tales we have and adapted so that humans believe that those are are the stories of our ancestors when in fact they aren't. And I think most of all, though, people should keep in mind there's a reason that these things are hidden from us, and they're not good reasons. And even more importantly, the truth is so much more wondrous than the lie. It really is.
So, in a previous show, have you guys discussed in detail the people with the elongated skulls that came from 100 light years away?
Yes, they crashed and first established in the Grand Canyon. And in the Grand Canyon, there's a place where there are a series of carved-out chambers at different levels, and a rancher found them. I went there, but by the time that I got there, they were all fenced off and had guards. But from what I've read and what I've seen pictures of, I can pretty well assure you that these were elongated head people. They probably found the New World too savage to try to establish in, so after their experience in the Grand Canyon, I think they went on to Egypt, and I think that they established themselves there because you had people that were ahead of hunters and gatherers who had already established subsistence level agriculture, that had learned how to irrigate the Nile, and had also begun to develop the Bronze Age, which didn't happen in the New World, even up to Columbus. You know, they became accepted, they became very well-liked and regarded, and established what led to the union of the Upper and Lower Nile, and created a great Egypt that we have today. The way of seeding the royal line persisted up until the Ptolemy dynasty, where you were a son of Ra, or you were a son of the sun. You bore Ra. And if you will look at the hieroglyphs that relate to Moses, you will see that he was called Moses Ra. To be designated Ra meant you were a son of the sun, meant that you were the offspring of a union between your maternal aunt, or you were the son of a woman who had had a unity with her paternal uncle. And that never changed until the Ptolemy dynasty.
So the people that came from 100 light years away with the elongated skulls, they settled also in the Grand Canyon. Now there are these giant caverns in the Grand Canyon that are like cut out of the side of the canyon where they found artifacts and things.
Yes.
So you're talking about those people, right?
Yeah, and to tell you quite honestly that down in the bottom where they kept their life support systems, they found battery acids that they've used since in their space probes and other things, because these things, if they use them, I mean, the best battery we can buy is a lithium battery. These things will last 100 times longer. If we use these salts in the batteries today, you buy a car, you got a battery that whenever that car wears out, you pull that battery out and put in the next one. That's the kind of battery you would have. If they made the plates in a battery anyway out of copper instead of lead, it would be just about as good. But, of course, everything on this planet is made with a short lifetime so that the monsters that control industry can make more money off the consumer. And then they'll bitch about, oh, well, too many people here, all their garbage, you know, filling up these landfalls and all this stuff. Yeah, because of your greed. It's not because they're consumers. You know, this planet can support a great many more people than are already here if the system is not corrupted.
Yeah, the system's so broken now.
It is broken. It is broken, and you see, we're becoming aware of the corruption. And that's why they want to get rid of most of the people, because there are too many for them to manage. That's why they want our guns in America. You know, America is held out because of the Second Amendment. And they want our guns so that they can play God on our asses. You know, that's what it's all about. And, you know, you take a monster like Feinstein, for instance, the Zionist. It does the bidding, is a toad for the elite. And, you know, to some extent, everybody in Congress, with the exception of maybe 3 or 4 people, is a toady in some way for the funds to run their next campaign. That's all they think about. And, they know they're wrong. They know that they're not representing the interests of the American people. And they rationalize, well, there are too many people. Maybe depopulation is the only way. Yeah. In their convoluted thinking. And that's what we have. Besides the fact, if we got somebody who has charisma and who could lead, would stand up and people would listen to, would lead us out of this darkness, they'll clone the son of a bitch, kill him, and use the clone. Don't think they don't. Don't think they don't. I think that's what they did to Kerry.
John Kerry? Have you seen those photos?
Oh.
He's about as non-human as it gets, if you just pay attention. He's about as non-human. He has no, it's like a succubus sucked his personality out and left this robot toad.
I feel that way about the president, too.
Oh, well, that's just a mongrel. Obama's a mongrel. He's smoked so much dope. He's, been party to so many lies, a corrupt Chicago gangster politician. He's got everything going for him. In the first place, he's controlled because he's not American. He's not eligible to hold office in this country, even as a senator or a representative. That's the kind of thing they want. The power elite wants some string to hold on everybody that they back and tailor for a powerful position in government or in the military. And until they have that string tied and they own this person, until they do that, they're not going to put them in a position of power. They just might get rid of them if it doesn't work out. But that's what all of this pedophilia is about. That's what all of this Satanism is about, because they can get you to do something through these vehicles that they can blackmail you for the rest of your life.
That's the way they maintain their control, right?
Yes. It is worse than I'm saying, and there's some things I don't talk about because I don't want to add to the terror that these monsters want to inflict on people. And there are a lot of people that just haven't come far enough to realize that we are just a breath away from a point where you will feel like you have nothing left to lose. And then they want us, before that happens, before the masses reach that point, they want to begin exterminating them. Because they know what's going to happen next.
That's right.
This is what it's all about. And look, it's an inevitable truth.
James actually talked about this during the last show we did with you too, Mark, and there's an article that I would like to direct people to. It was written by the 21stCenturyWire.com, and the title of the article is The Israeli Blackmail Machine. The Clintons weren't the only ones. And there's a brief snippet here. It says, perhaps the bigger issue is the stranglehold over the U.S. presidency by Israel and the tricks they have yet to unleash. How valuable would these type of sex tapes be when Israel is carpet bombing Gaza in the face of Washington? When nothing ever seems to add up, as is the case with the U.S.-Israel waltz. Maybe that's because of blackmail material kept in a safe place. The reality that our elected officials are one Franklin scandal away from complete political castration is an unsettling reality. The secret sex cabal and recordings that reside in Benjamin Netanyahu's private collection may point to the very reasons many U.S. presidents are never forthcoming to the atrocities committed by the Netanyahu regime. And so this has become the new norm. So now we're looking at a society, a future society, because they've gotten away with it thus far, in which the requirement to hold a political office will be that you are blackmailable. So it's only going to go downhill from there.
It has been a trend. Of course, they thought JFK, since he came from a family of mobsters, and Joe Kennedy was a mobster. He made his money bootlegging. He wasn't a mobster in the sense of Al Capone or Meyer Lansky, but he was a mobster. And with him being very close to one of the most powerful men in the world, Aristotle Onassis, he actually earned a credit that one of his sons would be president. Such things happen. So his eldest son, that was tailored for that position, to be a monster, died, was killed in the war. So it fell to JFK, and JFK did not want it. JFK had a back injury from Vietnam. He just didn't have the disposition, the lust for power, or anything like that. But his mother insisted. So he said, okay. And he tried to make a difference. He was a good man, one of the rarities. Maybe they felt like they had some kind of hold on him, but it didn't work out. So they did everything they could to vilify him before he was murdered. And, the latest assessment by any of the analysts that have looked for what happened to him, how he was murdered, points right to the CIA and to the Secret Service. I mean, it's indelible. After that, everybody of any power or authority that got involved did everything they could to suppress evidence, to persecute and prosecute witnesses, and killed them. All the way up and all the way down the scale of those that were involved in the whitewash, including Earl Warren, who was one of the worst, and he was the author of the Warren Commission report. So he told Jack Ruby, after Jack Ruby was in jail for assassinating Oswald, Jack Ruby said, if you'll take me to Washington, D.C., I'll tell you everything I know. But if I say anything here, they'll kill me. And Earl Warren told him, well, if you're afraid you'd be in any danger by saying anything, don't say it. That is a good example, a metaphor for the way everything was conducted in the so-called truth-finding that followed the assassination of one of our greatest presidents.
Myra, you don't have any corrupt politicians in Scotland, do you?
Yeah.
You almost made me cover myself with coffee. Thank you.
It's everywhere, really. It's global.
There is one more thing I would like to go back to from the last show we did. There's something I would like to follow up on. One of the things that's so important, so important, is for people to look at patterns and understand patterns of behavior, patterns of history. I think that, anyone can do it. They're not taught to do it because then they would understand what's really happening. And I think this also feeds into the transhumanist agenda, doesn't it? Because the only way you're ever going to be whole and complete or capable is if you're somehow augmented, but it's not necessary.
Crystal, I look at it a little bit differently, but I agree with you absolutely. I'd say this. They're destroying the earth, and they're kind of trying to plant a compensation in people's mind that, oh, well, I know that as you are, you can't survive. We'll make you different so you can survive whatever we do to the earth.
That's definitely a part of it, too. But when you understand the patterns that these people use and operate with, you can predict their next move. Because you know they're at A and they want to get to D, so you know that B and C have to come next. So there was something that I said during the last 5 minutes of the last show. I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to compare it with some recent articles that have come out. And this was about the border. When the border crisis happened, I was very concerned, and I was telling people, it's important that we watch all of the pieces on the board, but this one is really important. There's something going on here. So at the end of the show, we started talking about the border, and this is what I said. What I'm concerned about the border is we recently had Zionist Feinstein come out and say, ooh, there's another terrorist attack going to happen, and she knows because she's seen the plans, and I'm sure she is because she probably helped write the plan. And then we had Dick Cheney and some other social engineers come out and say, oh, it's coming. And poof, we have a border crisis. And the next thing you know, ooh, members of Al-Qaeda are sneaking through the border. I think they said they caught 7 of them. So this is opening the gateway. Psychologically, they are seeding the population to accept terrorism on our own soil. Now, yesterday, this article came out. Islamic terrorist groups are operating in the Mexican border city of Ciudad Juarez and planning to attack the United States with car bombs and other vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices. High-level federal law enforcement, intelligence, and other sources have confirmed to Judicial Watch that a warning bulletin for an imminent terrorist attack on the border has been issued. So you see where this is going. We know that they have to push harder and harder and harder, not just to take our guns, but it's the terror. They have to terrorize people into falling in line with the New World Order. That's so important, and it's been working. So this particular article was called Imminent Terrorist Attack Warning by Feds on U.S. Border, but it will escalate. You will start having bombings at malls, car bombings, and this will become the new Gaza ghetto. This can't happen. When you know where they want to go, you can predict how they plan to get there based on the way they've gotten there before. It's always the same pattern, always. There's a fellow here, his name is David Laurie Vanderbeek, who's running for governor, and he's pretty awake. He put out an article a week or two ago that Las Vegas is a target for the terrorists. Do you see where this is going? So how many more rights and privileges do you think you're going to have taken away when the mythical Al-Qaeda that crossed through the open border is car bombing the malls and high schools and casinos? This is, you see what I'm saying? James talks a lot about incrementalism, and it's true. They do. They have to set it up. It's like the long con. You know, there's different phases. And when the border crisis happened, the moment they said they caught Al-Qaeda coming through, everybody should have known exactly what that was about.
Yeah, CIA. Who created the Al-Qaeda? And who created ISIS? The CIA. All of these are fabrications by the CIA to conduct these socially engineered scenarios, inflicting more and more terror. But I'll tell you, there's something counterproductive about all of this. And I noticed this. There was a gun store very close to me called Cheaper Than Dirt. And I would go down there, and every time that there would be one of these false flags or whatever, I'd go down there, and that place would be full. People would be buying all this ammunition and guns and all that stuff. Every time that Spoofball, Feinstein, or any of that group, any time that they start their crap about gun control, any time that they do, here come a load of people, and I've run to them. You know, I was telling you that I go out to the Naval Air Force Base here in Fort Worth. Used to be Carswell. They sell guns out there. In the commissary, there's a little store that's attached to the commissary, and they sell guns in there. It's where they have the garden supplies and, you know, all the hardware. And they sell guns in there. And so I go in there, and there are people buying guns, you know, not just any guns, assault rifles that have a lot of power. They're handguns that they really don't want you to have, but they're for sale. One of the funny things that recently came up is Obama is trying to outlaw body armor.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, body armor.
That's so ridiculous.
Yeah, he wants you killed. So, you know, now body armor is not something that you're going to go out and hurt anybody with. You're just going to protect your life.
Right.
And now body armor is to be outlawed. You know, it just doesn't stop. First of all, if we had an honest Supreme Court that was doing its job, which is constitutional review, they're supposed to keep everybody honest with the Constitution. That's their job. That's what the Supreme Court was envisioned to be. And under some of the best Supreme Court justices we've had, that's been made clear over and over again. John Marshall made that clear over and over again. He was a very conservative Supreme Court justice, and he wrote more opinions than have ever been written by anyone, and they were flawless. I mean, I wouldn't agree with his politics, and most other people wouldn't, because he's ultra-conservative. But that's exactly what you need on the Supreme Court. Instead, we have monsters like Sotomayor and people that, you know, wouldn't have been confirmed, wouldn't even have had a chance of being mentioned 50 years ago, because they're far from scholars. They're far from having an impeccable history. No, Sotomayor, who is a racist and has made a comment that white men should be castrated. And this is what they confirm on the Supreme Court? You know, it tells you if somebody will follow my agenda, I don't care if they're Jack the Ripper. Doesn't it?
One of the things I'd like to hear you guys comment on, maybe all three of you, since Myrid hasn't even had a chance to talk yet, but I'd like all of you to tell me why the elite bad guys are not Archons, they're not fallen angels, they're not reptilians, and they're not ETs. Because there's a lot of strangeness in the UFO community, and there are a lot of quote-unquote researchers that kind of take us down that path. Who wants to start? Anybody?
Myrid, why don't you start? I didn't even know that you joined us, so I'm glad that you were able to make it. Why don't you?
Snuck in late. Well, I can speak from personal experience that they have a lot of interest in keeping people off the page and distracted and going down many different rabbit holes and not getting anywhere. And I think a lot of money and time is spent on getting people to do that. You know, it's kind of like during the Second World War, one of the things that helped win the war was people spewing out disinformation all the time. And my mother was one of those people because she worked for Cypher and all she did was put out code that meant nothing. And if you think of it nowadays, I actually think we are at a kind of silent war for information and knowledge in order to save ourselves on this planet. And there's, we're up against it, and we're up against people who have a vested interest in spewing out a lot of disinformation, misleading people, lying over and over again, and taking control of your mind, And people want others to do the thinking for them. They want other people to do the activism for them and do nothing. And that needs to stop because, knowledge is power. You become informed, you become empowered, and hopefully become motivated. And they don't want that. They don't want that to be the case, so it's in their best interest to keep everyone running around in the wrong direction and not pointing the finger at the people who are doing this. And they're very human. They're not Archons. They're not reptiles. They're not from another planet. They're psychopathic. It's hard for us, as I've said this before, it's very hard for us to understand them, because in order to do that, you have to be a psychopath yourself. And that's why I cannot get my head around it a lot of the time. And the only way I can understand it is to look at it historically, look how far back it goes and how much worse it's got.
Very well said, Myrid.
Thank
Very
you.
well said. Crystal, tell us why the elites are not Archons, fallen angels, they're not reptilians, they're not interdimensional ETs. Please elaborate.
Well, primarily because they have names and addresses on this planet. We know they're humans. I think that there are a lot of cowards on this planet, and I think that they are catered to repeatedly, because when you tell someone or encourage someone to believe that your enemy is they're from another planet and they have superpowers and they can mind meld and zap you with their laser beams, what chance do you have, right? And this is also the disguise. It's the cover story, because it hides these stories hide the true nature of the perpetrators. It hides the real dirty faces and bloody hands. And it reminds me of those cartoons from when I was a kid, when bank robbers would run out of a bank and then they would change their outfit really quick, and then the police would run up and say, which way did they go? And they point, and the cops take off after a non-existent bank robber, while the other ones laugh all the way, to their hideout with the money. And that's really what's going on. That's really what's going on. It's smoke and mirrors. That's all.
James, what bothers me is that so many researchers in the UFO world now are going down this rabbit hole of that the elite are really Archons, they're fallen angels, they're interdimensional ETs, they're reptilians. This is just, I really think it's taken us away from common sense, and it's completely steering us down a wrong path. I wondered if you could have the final word on all this.
Well, it draws interest. They want to sell books, they want to get paid to lecture, et cetera, et cetera. It's the ufology cottage industry crap all over again. But what I'd like to say is, as far as what we're talking about, I would like to talk about Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled. In that book, he gives an example. He was a psychiatrist, and he believed in most of the approaches to psychiatry that were conventional or standard medical practice, until he had one case And in this case, these parents had come to him concerned over their younger son. Their older son had committed suicide, and they told him they were afraid that this younger one would follow suit. So he said, well, I'll talk to him and maybe take him on as a patient. So he did, and he spent some time with the boy, and he found the boy healthy, well-balanced and everything. And then one day, the boy comes in and he's dejected. And the psychiatrist said, well, what's going on? And he said, well, it's my birthday today. And he said, well, why would you be dejected over that? And he said, my parents gave me a .22 rifle. And he says, well, do you like to shoot or whatever? And he says, yeah. He says, well, what makes you upset about that? And he said, well, it's the gun my brother used to commit suicide.
Oh.
Then, at that moment, Scott Peck says, I discovered evil. I knew there was such a thing as evil. Because, see, these people, for the convenience of making money and not finding honest solutions, not addressing real problems, but nursing illness, had built up this approach that there's no evil. It's all relative and all this BS. Well, there is evil. There are people that are pathological narcissists, and almost everyone is unfortunate enough to have one in their family somewhere. And if you can imagine, take this person that you can think of. You may be lucky and you don't have any pathological narcissists in your family. I did. Just imagine giving these people power of life and death over others and what would happen. And that's what we have here on Earth. We have looked the other way about these people among us. We have given them every opportunity out of pity or whatever. We've created a society where they have become very handy to the elite who use them, and that's what's wrong with the world today.
Good common sense. You know, we need to get back to good common sense. I want to thank you guys for doing both shows today.